It was 2:26 in the afternoon when the sky turned black in Murfreesboro, Illinois. Not dark. Not stormy. Black dot in the DeSoto school, 125 children were at their desks. In Murfreesboro, mothers were starting dinner. In the coal mines beneath the town, fathers were working underground, completely unaware that the world above them was about to cease to exist. No alarm sounded. No warning came. No official voice told anyone to take cover. Because in 1925, the United States government had a policy, an actual written policy that forbade weather forecasters from using the word tornado in public communications. The reasoning was that the word might cause panic. 695 people died that afternoon because of that silence. In 3.5 hours. A single tornado traveled 352 miles across Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana without lifting from the ground once. It moved faster than cars could drive away from it. It was in places more than a mile wide. It did not weaken. It did not pause. It consumed everything in its path with an indifference so complete that survivors spent the rest of their lives struggling to find words for what they had. Witness. This is the story of the tri-state tornado of March 18th, 1925. The longest, the deadliest, the most devastating tornado in the recorded history of the United States. And this is the story of the people who stood in its way, the decisions made in seconds, the instincts that saved lives, and the silence that followed that was, in its own way, as devastating as the storm itself. How does a monster like this form? How did so many people survive it? And what did the ones who made it out see when they finally looked up from the rubble? The answers will change the way you look at the sky. What you are about to hear is not a reconstruction. It is the testimony of real people from real towns who survived the most devastating tornado in American history and spent the rest of their lives trying to explain what the sky looked like from the inside of a monster. Stay with us. This story deserves your full attention. March 1925. The world was still carrying the scars of a war that had promised to be the last of all wars. Across the United States, an entire generation was trying to rebuild what remained, not just of cities and economies, but of hope itself. In the heart of the country, far from the skyscrapers of New York and the noise of Chicago, there was another America. An America of silent farms, of red barns against blue skies, of small towns where everyone knew each other by name, and where no one had ever heard the word meteorology spoken out loud. This was the heart of the Corn Belt, a generous, flat ribbon of land stretching from Missouri through Illinois and into Indiana, stitched together like an invisible seam across the map. For those who lived there, that plain had no end. The horizon was always the same, a straight line between earth and sky, as if the world had been built with a ruler and a plumb line. And it was precisely that vastness that sealed the fate of thousands of people that month. Because in the flat heart of America, there are no mountains to stop the wind, no hills to give warning, nothing between the sky and you. The towns that would be erased from the face of the earth on that March 18th had simple, honest names: Annapolis, Gorham, Murfreesboro, DeSoto, West Frankfort, Griffin, Allensville, Princeton. Names of places where people knew the baker by his first name, where a neighbor's child was another family's godchild, where the dead were buried in the same churchyard as their great-grandparents. These were communities built not on ambition, but on belonging, on the quiet understanding that a life shared with others was a life worth living. No one in those towns knew that the day just beginning would be the last day of their lives as they had always known them. No one knew that the sky, that immense and silent sky they watched every morning, was conspiring. The science of 1925 had no tools to see what was forming. There were no radars, no satellites, no automated alerts, no electronic sirens, no possibility of a warning reaching anyone's pocket in a matter of seconds. What existed was the sky itself, and the instinct of those who had lived beneath it for generations. There was also, on that March 18th, something different in the air, a strange pressure, a silence among the birds earlier than usual, a damp warmth that did not belong to that time of year. The oldest among them, those who had survived other storms, felt something they could not quite name, a stillness too complete to be natural, a held breath in the atmosphere as if the land itself were bracing. It was the warning sign of a monster. A monster that would travel 352 miles in an almost perfectly straight line across 3 states. A monster that would last 3.5 hours without interruption, and almost incomprehensible duration for a tornado of its violence. A monster that would kill 695 people and injure more than 2,000 before finally dying out in the hills of southwestern Indiana. To this day, no tornado in recorded American history has traveled farther, lasted longer, or killed more people in a single continuous path. Scientists and historians still debate the full scale of its power. Some estimates place the width of its destruction at over a mile across. Others suggest the pressure drop at its center may have been so extreme that structures didn't just collapse. They exploded outward, as if the air inside them was trying to escape. The people in its path had no warning, no protocol, no shelter built for what was coming. They had only the seconds between the moment they heard it. That sound survivors would describe again and again as 1,000 freight trains arriving at once, and the moment it was already upon them. This is the story of the tri-state tornado of 1925, the longest, the deadliest, the most devastating tornado ever recorded on American soil. And this is the story of the people who stood in its way, those who were lost, and the few who survived to tell what the sky looked like from the inside of a monster. They woke up early, as they always did. In Annapolis, Missouri, the miners were already pulling on their boots before sunrise. The same boots they wore every day into the earth. In Murfreesboro, Illinois, mothers were stoking wood stoves to warm kitchens that smelled of coffee and cornbread. In DeSoto, children were gathering their books and coats, arguing over the last biscuit at the breakfast table, unaware that for many of them, school that day would become the place where their story ended. March 18, 1925, began the way most Wednesdays begin in small American towns: ordinary, unremarkable. Day that asked nothing unusual of the people living it. The temperature that morning was mild for March, warmer than expected, which most people welcomed as a sign that winter was finally loosening its grip. Farmers walked their fields and noted the soft, almost spring-like quality of the air. Shopkeepers opened their doors and left them open. Children ran to school without buttoning their coats all the way up. Nobody read warmth as danger. Not yet, but several hundred miles to the southwest, the atmosphere was doing something that no farmer, no schoolteacher, no coal miner in the Corn Belt had the instruments to detect. 2 massive bodies of air were colliding. From the Gulf of Mexico, a surge of warm, moisture-heavy air was pushing northward, the kind of tropical breath that carries the seeds of violent weather. Meeting it head-on was a cold, dry Arctic air mass pressing down from Canada with the patience and weight of a glacier. Between these two forces, a zone of extraordinary instability was building along a front that stretched across the central United States. This collision of air masses is the engine behind all severe tornado outbreaks. When warm, moist air is forced rapidly upward by colder, denser air, it rises with tremendous speed, spinning as it goes, shaped by the rotation of the Earth itself, a phenomenon known as the Coriolis effect. Under the right conditions, that rising column of air begins to twist, to tighten, to descend. And when it finally touches the ground, it carries with it the full, concentrated violence of the atmosphere. On March 18th, the conditions were not merely right. They were, in the language of modern meteorology, almost perfectly catastrophic. The storm that would become the tri-state tornado first touched the ground near Ellington, in Reynolds County, Missouri. At approximately 1:01 in the afternoon, those first minutes were almost modest. If a tornado can ever be called modest. It moved northeast through the forested hills of the Missouri Ozarks, gathering strength the way a fire gathers fuel, slowly at first, and then with a speed that defies reason. The trees gave way. The earth tore open in long, dark furrows, and the storm, still young and still accelerating, turned its face toward the flatlands ahead. What was coming for those flatlands was something meteorologists today classify as a violent, long-track tornado, a rare and terrible, category of storm that sustains itself far longer and travels far farther than the overwhelming majority of tornadoes ever do. Most tornadoes last only minutes. Most travel only a few miles. The tri-state tornado would refuse every statistical expectation. It would not stop for 219 miles in Missouri and Illinois alone. Back in those ordinary towns. The morning continued its quiet rhythms. In Murfreesboro, a city of nearly 12,000 people and one of the largest in southern Illinois, the school day was well underway. Teachers wrote on blackboards. Students copied lessons into notebooks. The principal at Longfellow School had no reason to look out the window with any particular concern. The sky to the southwest was darkening in that heavy, greenish way that old-timers sometimes associated with bad weather, but in March, storms were not uncommon. In DeSoto, the elementary school was full. More than 125 children sat in their classrooms, their voices rising and falling with the rhythm of a school day that felt entirely normal. Their teacher, a young woman who had grown up in the county and knew its weather well, noticed something unusual about the light outside, a strange, filtered quality, almost yellow. But she continued her lesson. In the coal town of West Frankfort, the afternoon shift had not yet begun. Miners who were off-duty sat in front of their houses, some of them looking at the sky to the southwest with the quiet, experienced attention of men who had learned to read the land and the air as naturally as they read a clock. What they saw troubled them. But they had no words for it yet. And they had no time, because 1925 had no warning system. The United States Weather Bureau, the predecessor to today's National Weather Service, had the tools to observe weather patterns at fixed stations across the country, but those observations moved slowly. Telegraphed reports, hand-drawn maps, forecasts issued once or twice a day, based on data that was already hours old by the time it reached the public. More critically, the Weather Bureau at that time actively discouraged the use of the word tornado in public forecasts. The reasoning, however misguided it seems today, was that the word itself might cause panic, that warning people of a tornado might do more harm than the storm. And so the language of official weather communication remained deliberately vague, cautious, restrained. While the monster was already on the ground and moving, the people in its path were being told nothing. No alarm rang in Murfreesboro. No bell warned the children of DeSoto to take cover. No voice came over any wire to the miners of West Frankfort. The first warning any of them received was the sound of the tornado itself. And by then for many, itself. There was simply no time left. The sound before the dark survivors would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe it. Some said it sounded like 1,000 freight trains arriving at once, a low, continuous roar that seemed to come not from any single direction, but from everywhere at the same time, as if the air itself had learned to scream. Others described it as the grinding of enormous gears, metal against metal, a mechanical fury that had no right to exist in nature. A few, the ones whose voices never quite steadied when they told the story years later, said it sounded like nothing they had ever heard before or since, and that no comparison they could offer would ever be adequate. What they were hearing was the sound of air rotating at speeds that modern meteorology estimates may have reached 200 miles per hour or more at the tri-state tornado's peak intensity. That rotation created an almost continuous acoustic signature, deep, resonant, overwhelming, that arrived seconds before the storm itself became visible through the rain and debris it carried like a dark, churning wall. And in 1925, that sound was the only warning anyone got. The tornado that crossed into Illinois was no longer the modest gathering storm that had touched down in the Missouri hills. It had fed on the flat, unobstructed terrain of the Corn Belt for nearly an hour. It had widened. It had deepened. Eyewitnesses who saw it approaching from a distance described a mass that seemed to fill the entire southwestern sky, not the narrow, rope-like funnel that most people picture when they imagine a tornado, but something closer to a vast, dark curtain being drawn across the horizon. This distinction matters enormously. The tri-state tornado, at its most destructive phases, is believed to have been a multiple vortex tornado, a single parent circulation containing two or more smaller, intensely rotating subvortices spinning around a common center. This structure explains one of the most disturbing features of the storm's damage path: the uneven, almost random pattern of destruction it left behind. Houses on one side of a street were obliterated down to their foundations, while houses directly across the road were left standing with their windows intact. Survivors found themselves alive in the middle of total destruction with no rational explanation for why they had been spared. In the town of Gorham, Illinois, the tornado arrived without a moment's notice. Gorham was a small community, fewer than 500 people. But what happened there in those terrible minutes became one of the defining tragedies of the entire disaster. The storm struck the town with full, catastrophic force, destroying nearly every structure in its path. Of all the towns the tri-state tornado consumed that day, Gorham suffered one of the highest proportional death tolls. Entire families were lost. Entire streets simply ceased to exist. Survivors pulled from the wreckage described a sensation many would repeat almost word for word: a sudden, violent drop in air pressure so severe that it felt as though the air was being physically pulled from their lungs. This is consistent with what scientists now understand about the pressure differential at the core of an intense tornado. A drop so rapid and extreme that wooden structures don't merely collapse under wind force. They fail from the inside out, their walls pushed outward by the relative pressure difference, their roofs lifted before the walls have time to respond. In those seconds, human decisions became everything. A woman who threw herself into a root cellar behind her house survived. Her neighbor who ran for the barn did not. A schoolteacher who pushed her students under their desks and covered them with her own body was found alive in the rubble, her students alive beneath her. A man who stepped outside to look at the sky, as so many did, drawn by that terrible, magnetic roar, was never seen again. The difference between survival and death, again and again across the entire path of the tri-state tornado, came down to seconds. To instinct. To the particular place a person happened to be standing when the sky finally broke, open above them. The monster was not finished. It was, in fact, still accelerating. Murfreesboro, the city that broke. Chapter 4. Murfreesboro, the city that broke. Of all the cities that stood in the path of the tri-state tornado, none suffered more than Murphyo. It was the largest city the storm would directly strike, a community of nearly 12,000 people. The county seat of Jackson County, Illinois. A place with brick buildings and paved streets and a sense of permanence that smaller towns could only aspire to. Murfreesboro had a hospital. It had schools. It had a sense of itself as a city that had endured hard times before and would endure them again. It had no idea what was coming. The tornado entered Murfreesboro from the southwest at approximately 2:26 in the afternoon. What followed in the next several minutes would constitute the single deadliest urban strike of any tornado in American history. When the storm finally passed and the survivors began to emerge from the wreckage, the death toll in Murfreesboro alone stood at 234 people. More than any other single community struck that day. More than any single community struck by any tornado before or since. In the recorded history of the United States, the storm moved through the city in a diagonal path of destruction, roughly a mile wide. In those neighborhoods, nothing was left standing in any meaningful sense. Houses built of wood, and most houses in Murfreesboro in 1925 were built of wood, were reduced to splinters and scattered across lots, where nothing remained to indicate that a home had ever existed there. Brick structures fared somewhat better, but not by much. Walls collapsed inward. Roofs were lifted clean off and deposited blocks away. The city's infrastructure, its water lines, its telegraph wires, its gas mains was severed in an instant, turning the aftermath into a crisis that compounded the original catastrophe. Fires broke out almost immediately. The severed gas lines ignited. And, with the water system destroyed and the fire department's equipment buried or damaged, those fires burned for hours. Survivors who had lived through the tornado itself now faced a second enemy, moving slowly and deliberately through the ruins of their neighborhoods. Some who had survived the storm did not survive the fire. The destruction of Murfreesboro was not the work of one disaster, but two arriving in terrible sequence. Among the places the tornado struck within the city, None carried a more devastating weight of tragedy than its schools. Longfellow School was in session when the storm arrived. The building, like so many school structures of that era, was not built to withstand the forces that were about to be applied to it. When the tornado struck, the roof failed first, then the walls. Children and teachers were buried beneath the collapse. Rescue workers, neighbors, fathers, anyone with hands willing to dig, arrived within minutes and began pulling survivors from the debris with no equipment other than their own strength and the desperate urgency of people who knew that time was the only currency that mattered. The images that emerged from Murfreesboro schools in the hours after the storm, carried first by word of mouth, then by newspaper, then by the national consciousness, became the defining human face of the tri-state tornado. Not statistics, not weather data. Children. Those who survived the strike on Murfreesboro described the moments of impact in terms that remained consistent across decades of collected testimony. The darkness came first. Not the gradual darkening of an approaching storm, but an instantaneous, total darkness, as if someone had extinguished the sun. Then the pressure change, violent and physical, a sensation in the ears and chest that survivors compared to being submerged suddenly in deep water. Then the sound, which by this point was not heard so much as felt, a vibration that passed through walls and floors and bones alike. And then for those who survived, silence. A silence so complete and so wrong that several survivors described it as more frightening than the storm itself. Because in that silence, they began to understand what they were buried under. And they began to call out, hoping someone was still there to hear them. In Murfreesboro, enough people called out that morning to fill the history books, but far too many never made a sound again. If Murfreesboro represented the scale of the disaster, DeSoto represented its cruelest face. DeSoto was a small coal mining town in southern Illinois, fewer than 1,800 people. The kind of place where a single family might have cousins on every block and where the rhythms of daily life move slowly, predictably, with the quiet dignity of communities that asked little of the world, beyond the chance to work and live in peace. On the afternoon of March 18th, most of DeSoto's men were underground, the coal mines ran day shifts, and the miners had descended into the earth hours before the storm arrived. In a bitter and unintended irony, the very thing that defined their hard and dangerous profession, working beneath the ground, saved most of their lives that day. While the tornado erased the world above them, the miners continued working in tunnels that the storm could not reach, unaware that when they surfaced, the town they had left that morning would no longer exist in any recognizable form. Their families were not so fortunate. The DeSoto School stood near the center of town. It was a two-story building, of the kind common to small Midwestern communities of that era, wood frame, large windows, a bell tower above the entrance that the children could hear from 3 blocks away. On the afternoon of March 18th, more than 125 children were inside, seated at their desks in classrooms on both floors, their school day moving through its ordinary afternoon rhythms. The tornado struck DeSoto at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon. The school was in its direct path. The building offered almost no resistance. The roof went first, peeled away in a single violent motion by the pressure differential at the storm's leading edge. Then the upper floor collapsed onto the lower floor. Then the walls gave way entirely, and the structure that had stood as the center of the community's educational and civic life for years ceased to exist in a matter of seconds. 33 children died in DeSoto that afternoon. Most of them died in that school. The survivors who were pulled from the wreckage in the hours that followed described experiences that no child should carry through a lifetime. One girl, 7 years old, was found seated at her desk, the desk still upright, the floor beneath it still intact, a small island of improbable survival surrounded on all sides by complete destruction. She was uninjured. She did not speak for several hours after her rescue. When she finally did, she asked for her teacher. Her teacher had not survived. A young boy was found beneath a collapsed wall, pinned but alive, still holding the reader he had been studying when the darkness came. Rescuers who worked to free him later said that what struck them most was not his injuries, which were significant, but the absolute calm with which he answered their questions, the particular calm, as one rescuer put it, of a child who had not yet fully understood what had happened to the world around him. That understanding would come later. For many of the survivors of DeSoto, it would take years. The fathers surfaced from the mines to find their town gone. There is no other way to describe what met them when they came up from underground that late afternoon. The familiar landscape of their daily lives, the streets, the houses, the school, the church had been rearranged into something unrecognizable. Men who had spent their working lives in the controlled darkness of coal tunnels stood in the open air and struggled to locate the places where their homes had been. Some walked past their own foundations without recognizing them. And then, one by one, they began to understand. They began to run. The search for children in DeSoto, that evening, carried out by miners with their bare hands, by neighbors, by anyone capable of lifting debris, was the kind of effort that exists at the absolute boundary of human endurance. Men dug until their hands bled. They called names into rubble that did not answer. They carried children they recognized and children they did not, to the makeshift aid stations appearing at the edges of the destruction. DeSoto lost more children, proportionally, than any other community struck by the tri-state tornado. It is a distinction that the town carried quietly and heavily for the rest of its history. The ones who ran and the ones who stayed in every disaster. There is a moment of decision. It arrives without announcement, without preparation, and without mercy. It asks a question that no one is ever truly ready to answer, and it demands that answer in seconds. In the path of the tri-state tornado, that moment came for thousands of people across 3 states on the afternoon of March 18, 1925, and the choices made in those seconds to run or to stay, to descend or to remain, to open a door or to press against a wall, became the difference between a life continued and life ended. What the historical record of the tri-state tornado reveals, pieced together from survivor testimony collected over decades, is something that challenges every instinct. Running in most cases was the wrong choice. The tornado moved at an average speed of approximately 62 miles per hour across its path, faster than any person could run, faster than many vehicles of that era could travel on unpaved rural roads. Those who attempted to flee on foot, or who jumped into automobiles and drove away from the storm, often found themselves overtaken. The storm was not chasing them. It simply arrived where they were going before they did. The ones who survived again and again were the ones who went down. Root cellars saved lives that afternoon in numbers that no official count has ever fully captured. These were the simple, partially buried storage chambers that farm families across the Midwest built beneath or adjacent to their homes, designed to keep vegetables cool through summer and protected through winter. Never intended as storm shelters, but serving that purpose with a reliability that no above-ground structure could match on. March 18th. The earth itself, heavy and indifferent and ancient, absorbed the violence of the storm in a way that wood and brick simply could not. Survivors, who rode out the tornado in root cellars, described a sequence of sensations that remained vivid for decades. The roar arriving first and growing until it seemed to occupy every available space inside the skull. Then a pressure change so sudden and severe that ears rang and eyes blurred. Then a weight against the cellar door, not a single impact, but a sustained grinding pressure, as if the storm were attempting to peel the earth open from above. Then, after what most described as between 30 seconds and 2 minutes that felt like an entire lifetime, the pressure released. The roar began to recede, and a quiet returned that felt, in the first moments, almost indistinguishable from death. Those who climbed out found a world that no longer resembled the one they had descended from. Not everyone had a cellar. Not everyone had time to reach one. For those caught in the open, in fields, on roads, inside vehicles, survival became a matter of terrain and instinct. Several survivors described throwing themselves into ditches or low-lying depressions in the earth and pressing their bodies flat against the ground, while the storm passed directly over them. The physics that made this possible are the same physics that make root cellars effective. The most violent rotation in a tornado occurs above the ground surface, and even a shallow depression can place a human body below the worst of that. Rotation. One farmer in Illinois was caught in an open field with no shelter of any kind within reach. He later told a local newspaper that he lay face down in a furrow between two rows of last year's corn stubble, wrapped his arms around his head, and did not move. The tornado passed close enough that he felt the suction attempting to lift him from the ground. He held on. When it was over, the field around him had been scraped nearly clean. His house, visible from where he lay, was gone. He walked to where it had stood and found his Bible open in the mud dot inside the towns. The decisions were different and the margins even thinner dot in West Frankfurt. A woman heard the roar beginning and pulled her 3 children into the space. Beneath her staircase, a choice based on nothing more than the instinct that interior, low spaces were safer than exterior walls. The exterior walls of her house were destroyed. The staircase and the small space beneath it remained standing, an island of structure in a field of splinters. With 4 people alive inside it dot in Griffin, Indiana, a man who had lived through a lesser tornado years before recognized the sound immediately and drove his family into a ditch at the side of the road before the storm arrived. His house was leveled. His car, left on the road above the ditch, was carried more than 200 feet. These stories repeat with variations across the entire 352-mile path of the storm. They are stories of imperfect knowledge and perfect instinct, of people who did not know the science but understood in the deepest and most animal part of themselves that the earth was safer than the air. They were right. The long silence after the tornado crossed into Indiana, at approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it was weakening now, not gently. Not apologetically, but with the slow, grudging reluctance of something that had consumed everything available to it and was finally running out of fuel. The terrain was changing. The flat, unobstructed expanse of the Illinois plains was giving way to the gentler, more varied topography of southwestern Indiana, where low hills and river valleys interrupted the perfect geometry of the Corn Belt. The atmospheric conditions that had sustained the storm for 3.5 hours were beginning to destabilize near the small community of Princeton, Indiana. The tri-state tornado finally lifted from the ground. It did not end dramatically. It did not go out in a final explosion of violence. It simply rose gradually back into the clouds from which it had descended, as if the sky were quietly reclaiming something it had briefly and catastrophically released. By 4:30 in the afternoon, the storm that had traveled 352 miles and killed 695 people was, in meteorological terms, over. What it left behind was not over. Not even close. The silence that followed was, by every surviving account, profound and deeply wrong. In Murfreesboro, in DeSoto, in Gorham, in Griffin, in every community along the path. The sudden absence of sound was itself disorienting. A vacuum, where noise had been so total and so violent that the return of ordinary quiet felt like a new kind of catastrophe. Survivors described emerging from cellars and wreckage into a world that looked as though it had been constructed by someone who had only heard a description of the original and gotten most of the details wrong. Trees stood stripped of every branch, their trunks smooth and pale, rising from ground that had been scoured to bare earth. Streets existed where houses did not. Foundations remained where walls had stood for decades. Objects appeared in locations that defied any rational explanation. A child's shoe in a field 3 miles from the nearest town. A family photograph undamaged and upright, leaning against a fence post in the middle of a debris field. Its subjects smiling from a world that no longer existed around them. The rescuers came from everywhere. From neighboring towns that had been spared. From farms at the edges of the destruction path. From the coal mines where word reached the underground shifts within hours, and men came up still wearing their work clothes, their headlamps still lit, and walked directly into the wreckage without stopping to change or eat or rest. What they encountered tested the limits of what human beings can absorb and continue functioning. The scale of the destruction across southern Illinois alone was unlike anything most of them had ever seen or would ever see again. Entire neighborhoods reduced to kindling. Familiar landmarks simply absent, not damaged, not partially standing, but gone, as though they had been subtracted from the landscape by some enormous and indifferent hand. And among the wreckage, the survivors, some walking, some calling out, some sitting in a silence that was not peace but shock. Medical resources were overwhelmed within hours. Hospitals that had survived the storm, some of them partially damaged, received patients far beyond their capacity. Churches, schoolhouses, and private homes became emergency treatment centers. Doctors and nurses worked through the night of March 18th and the days that followed with supplies that were insufficient for the injuries they were treating. Requests for help went out by whatever communication lines remained intact, and from across the region, and eventually from across the country. Help began to arrive, but the help that arrived could not address the deepest wound the storm had left. That wound was not physical. It was the wound of a community that had lost, in 3.5 hours, the fabric of everything it had built over generations. The neighbors, the institutions, the shared history that makes a collection of houses into a place with meaning. In DeSoto, parents searched for children. In Murfreesboro, families searched for family. In Gorham, there were households where no one was left to search for anyone. Grief of that magnitude does not resolve. It reorganizes. The survivors of the tri-state tornado carried what they had seen and lost for the rest of their lives, in the particular way that people carry things for which there is no adequate language. They rebuilt their houses. They returned to their schools and their mines and their farms. They raised children who had not been there and did not fully understand, and they told the story as best they could, knowing that the telling was always incomplete, because some things, once witnessed, belong only to those who were present, and some silences once heard never fully leave what the storm left behind. Science, memory, and the long road to warning in the weeks and months that followed March 18, 1925. The United States began the slow and painful process of accounting for what had happened. The numbers, when they were finally assembled, were staggering. 695 confirmed dead across 3 states, Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana. More than 2,000 injured. Entire communities destroyed or fundamentally altered. Property losses estimated at nearly $17 million at 1925 values, a sum that, adjusted for inflation, represents hundreds of millions of dollars by modern standards. 15,000 people left homeless in the immediate aftermath, dependent on relief efforts organized by the Red Cross and by state and local governments that were themselves struggling to comprehend the scale of the disaster. But numbers, as they always do in the presence of genuine catastrophe, failed to capture the truth of what had occurred. The truth was in the smaller counts. The 33 children who died in DeSoto, the 234 dead in Murfreesboro alone. The communities where the ratio of survivors to victims was low enough that the word community itself had to be reconsidered. Because a community requires enough people to sustain the relationships that give it meaning. And in some of the towns along the tri-state path, that threshold had been crossed. The scientific community responded to the disaster with a seriousness that, while it could not help those already lost, would eventually save countless lives in the decades to come. The tri-state tornado forced a fundamental reconsideration of how the United States understood, tracked, and communicated severe weather. The storm's extraordinary length and duration demanded explanation. How could a single tornado sustain itself for 219 miles across Missouri and Illinois without lifting from the ground? How could it travel at speeds that made escape by vehicle nearly impossible? How could it kill so many people in communities that had, by the standards of 1925, reasonable time to observe the approaching storm and take action? The answer is that meteorologists and researchers developed over the following years and decades reshaped the entire field of tornado. Science taught the concept of the long-track tornado a storm, capable of sustaining itself over extraordinary distances under the right atmospheric conditions, became a subject of serious academic study. The role of flat, unobstructed terrain in allowing tornado maintenance was documented and incorporated into forecasting theory. The relationship between atmospheric instability, wind shear, and tornado longevity was examined with a rigor that 1925 science had not previously applied to these storms. But perhaps the most significant legacy of the tri-state tornado was the change it eventually forced in how America warned its citizens. Weather Bureau's policy of avoiding the word tornado in public forecasts, that Extraordinary act of institutional caution that had left hundreds of thousands of people, without any official warning on March 18th, came under sustained criticism in the years following the disaster. The argument that the word itself might cause panic was weighed against the reality of 695 dead in a single afternoon, and found catastrophically wanting. Change, however, came slowly. Bureaucracies move at their own pace, and the culture of meteorological caution that had produced the no tornado warning policy was deeply entrenched. It was not until 1950, 25 years after the tri-state disaster, that the Weather Bureau formally authorized the use of the word tornado in public forecasts. 1 year later, in 1951, the first dedicated tornado forecasting unit in American history was established. Within a decade, a network of trained storm spotters was beginning to take shape. Within 2 decades, Doppler radar, technology capable of detecting the rotation inside a thunderstorm before a tornado touches the ground, was moving from military research toward civilian application. The path from the silence of March 18, 1925, to the sophisticated early warning systems of the modern era is a path measured in lives. Every advance in tornado forecasting represents, somewhere in its history, a disaster that made the inadequacy of the previous system impossible to ignore. The tri-state tornado was the disaster that began that accounting in earnest. The event so large, so deadly, and so undeniable that it could not be absorbed into the existing framework without changing that framework permanently. Today, the National Weather Service issues tornado warnings with an average lead time of 30 minutes. 30 minutes is not a long time, but against the 0 minutes that the people of Murfreesboro and DeSoto and Gorham received on March 18, 1925, it is the difference between a fighting chance and no chance at all. The storm that killed 695 people ultimately, and in the only way such things can be said to have meaning, helped build the system that protects millions. It is not a consolation, but it is a truth. The sky we share, memory, meaning, and the storm that never fully passes there is a particular kind of memory that belongs only to survivors. It is not the memory of historians, assembled from documents and photographs and the testimony of others. It is not the memory of communities, preserved in monuments and annual observances and the stories parents tell their children on quiet evenings. It is something more immediate and more permanent than either of those. A memory written not in words but in the body itself. In the instinctive turn of the head toward the southwest when the sky darkens in a certain way. In the particular quality of attention that never fully relaxes when the air grows warm and still in early spring. The survivors of the tri-state tornado carried that memory for the rest of their lives. Many of them lived long lives. The disaster of March 18, 1925, occurred early enough in the 20th century that some survivors were still alive to speak about it when serious oral history efforts began in the 1970s and 1980s. Their testimonies, collected by local historians, university researchers, and journalists with the patience to sit and listen, form the most irreplaceable part of what we know about that afternoon. Not the meteorological record, which science has reconstructed with increasing precision, but the human record, which can only be preserved in the voices of those who were present. What those voices describe, consistently and across decades of distance from the event, is not primarily the destruction. It is the before, the quality of the light that morning, the particular warmth of the air, the silence of the birds, the way the sky looked to the southwest in the minutes before the sound began. The survivors of the tri-state tornado became, without choosing to, the most attentive readers of weather that their communities had ever produced. They watched the sky with an expertise born not of education but of experience, the kind of experience that leaves no room for casual observation. Several survivors, interviewed late in their lives, described the same recurring experience. Every spring, when the atmospheric conditions began to resemble those of March 18, 1925, something in them shifted. Not panic. They were careful to distinguish between panic and what they felt. Something quieter and more fundamental. An alertness. A waiting. As if the body, having once absorbed that particular combination of signals, had encoded them permanently and would never again allow them to pass unnoticed. This is not pathology. It is wisdom earned at an unbearable price. The towns rebuilt. Murfreesboro rebuilt its schools and its neighborhoods and its sense of itself as a city capable of endurance. DeSoto rebuilt more slowly, in the way that communities rebuild when the loss has been proportionally enormous, not just structures, but the people who would have filled them. Gorham rebuilt. Griffin rebuilt. Princeton rebuilt. The Corn Belt, as it always had, absorbed what the sky had done to it and returned to the work of living. But the rebuilding was never quite a return to what had been. Communities that survive catastrophe of this magnitude are not restored. They are transformed. The shared experience of the storm and of the loss that followed it became part of the identity of every town along the tri-state path in a way that no subsequent generation could fully inherit, but could never entirely escape. The children of survivors grew up in households where March 18th was not simply a date on the calendar, where certain silences at the dinner table had a history attached to them, where the storm, never fully named in ordinary conversation, was always present in the background of family life like a long shadow cast by something just outside the frame. What does a storm of this magnitude ask of us a century later? It asks, first, for honesty about what we do not control. The atmosphere operates according to principles that science has illuminated with remarkable precision. We understand now, far better than anyone understood in 1925, the conditions that produce violent tornadoes, the terrain that sustains them, the atmospheric signatures that precede them. And yet the tornado itself, when it forms and touches the ground, remains a force entirely outside human authority. It does not negotiate. It does not respond to need or prayer or the particular innocence of the people in its path. It is the atmosphere doing what the atmosphere does, indifferent in the way that only nature can be truly indifferent. It asks. Second, for humility about the limits of warning. 13 minutes of lead time is a genuine achievement, the product of decades of scientific work, technological development, and the hard institutional lesson that the tri-state tornado forced upon a generation of meteorologists and policymakers. But 13 minutes is also a reminder of how narrow the margin remains between the knowledge we have built and the forces we are attempting to anticipate. And it asks, finally, for remembrance, not the remembrance of disaster as spectacle, not the appetite for destruction that treats catastrophe as entertainment, but the remembrance of the specific, irreplaceable people who stood in the path of that storm on a Wednesday afternoon in March 1925, living ordinary lives in ordinary towns, asking nothing of the world beyond the chance to continue. The 695 who did not get that chance deserve to be remembered by name in the towns where they lived, in the history that recorded what happened to them, and the ones who survived, who climbed out of cellars and wreckage into a world they no longer recognized, and rebuilt it anyway, and watched the sky for the rest of their lives, deserve to be remembered for what they taught us about storms, about survival, about the particular courage required simply to look up at the sky again after it has done its worst. The storm of March 18, 1925, has been over for a century. The sky it passed through is the same sky we share today. We owe it our attention.